if you've never thought about the problem that I'm describing here, the sin of King David in the Old Testament provides a perfect example of God passing over heinous, deadly sin. The story is told in 2 Samuel chapter 11. David, who is king, many of you know this story, sees an attractive woman, Bathsheba. Bathsheba's married to a man named Uriah. David asks about Bathsheba, and with a knowledge that she is married to Uriah, still calls for her, has her brought, and he spends the night with her. Adultery. Uriah was off at war during this time, so he was gone for an extended period of time. Well, word gets back to David that Bathsheba is now pregnant, meaning that David's going to get caught in his sin because Uriah isn't anywhere around. So David, in an attempt to cover up his sin, calls for Uriah and has him brought back home. Hopefully they'll spend a night together, and then everything will be covered over and it will look all right. Well, Uriah comes home, but he refuses to spend a night with his wife while all the other men are out fighting the battle, except for David, who should be out there with them fighting. And so Uriah doesn't. He sleeps on a porch elsewhere and doesn't go into his house and goes back to the battle. David needs to take another step to cover over his sin. And so what he does, compounding sin with sin, he sends word to Joab, who's the commander of the army, to have Uriah killed in battle. He says, put him out in front, and then when you charge, have everyone withdraw, see to it that he dies. It's exactly what they did. It happened. Uriah dies at the command of David. Murder. The most scandalous thing about the story comes in the next chapter, 2 Samuel chapter 12, where David's friend Nathan comes to him to correct him for his cowardice and his lust and his murder. David ends up seeing his sin, and then Nathan says something to him that no one expects. And it ought to take us back as well. Let me read to you the verse. This is 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 13. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Yes, you have. Adultery, murder. And Nathan said to David, the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. The Lord has put away your sin. He just passes over it. Adultery, murder, and David just goes on being king, to which we ought to say, you ought to say, where is the justice in that? What kind of a God just passes over sin? This is a huge problem. The whole point of verses 25 and 26 is that God forgiving sin calls into question the justice of God. But it doesn't stop at that. It also tells us that God has done something to uphold his righteousness, to publicly display his righteousness. Listen to these verses, beginning in verses 25 and 26. This is Christ Jesus. He is the one whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. So he put him forward God put Christ forward by his blood. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So, big theological word number 2. The solution to the divine dilemma, propitiation. Propitiation, a big word referring to wrath being satisfied. Wrath being averted, the appeasing of anger. In other words, it presupposes that God is a God of wrath, whose anger and judgment appropriately falls on sinners. But through propitiation, his wrath is averted, his wrath is redirected, his wrath is satisfied, and his attitude toward us is changed. Propitiation is the answer to what chapter 1, verse 18 describes as the wrath of God that is being revealed against heaven, from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. And it's the solution to the future day of wrath described in chapter 2, verse 5. That day, we are told, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. Why did God put Christ forward as a propitiation? Verse 25 and 26 both tell us it's repeated. This was to show God's righteousness. One of the reasons for the death of Christ is to display the righteousness of God. He's not just showing his love. God shows himself to be just and holy. When God put Christ forward, this was God saying, this is who I am. I will not tolerate sin. I will not simply push aside my wrath. No, the penalty will fall. And he demonstrates his righteous character. See, the divine penalty for sin, for your sin, for my sin, for David's sin, for everyone's sin, cannot and will not simply be removed. God must punish sin. If he does not, he is not a righteous God. He is not a good God. Therefore, when God justifies sinners, he doesn't simply move aside his wrath. Rather, he takes that wrath and he executes it upon his Son. Rather than it falling upon us, it falls upon him. It falls upon the innocent one. It falls upon the sinless one. And in doing so, it displays the righteousness of God, and it proves that his justice has indeed been satisfied. What righteousness? What righteousness is this? We sing this. What righteousness was there revealed that sets the guilty free, that justifies ungodly men and calls the filthy clean? What righteousness is this? A righteousness that proved to all, your justice has been met, and holy wrath is satisfied through one atoning death. This is the death of Christ in our place. That atonement satisfies the wrath of God that we deserve, so that when we put our faith in him, the punishment that we deserve falls upon Christ, and God is propitiated through the work of his Son.